seniors, class of 2020, Omaha Bryan High School, or any other school. If any teacher's trying to rip off my lesson, it's all good. This is week 2 of eLearning, distance learning, aka Corona curriculum. So, a couple things. Had some great feedback from first video. One of my students told me that while the video was fine, that you guys spent like 10 minutes looking up my nose. So I've adjusted the camera angle, trying to keep my posture down so that nobody's having to see my mocos, all right? And then 2, huge shout out to my friend, Mr. Wiener at Omaha South High School. He told me that my first video looked like an ISIS propaganda video on YouTube. So I added Old Glory here, the Stars and Stripes. It should be in there anyway since this is an American government class, right? So appreciate the constructive feedback. Keep it coming. Like I said, I'm an official YouTuber right now. This is new for me. But it's more about the information. So what are we talking about this week? We are moving along in Unit 2 with the media and the role of the media in our political system, right? So with regards to politics, when we talk about media, we're talking about the source of information that we are getting. It's basically another word for the news. And the main function of the media is to provide information to the public so that we can make decisions on what we think for ourselves and then engage in the political process, right? So let's first start talking about types of media and what their purposes are. The first type I'm going to talk to you about is print media. So print as in on a page. We're talking about newspapers and magazines. Once upon a time, this was the main source of information to the public. That's no longer the case, but it's still very, very, very important. And a lot of times, actually, even if you get your news from some of these other sources, if they're credible, you might pay attention and notice that they are citing print media sources for their news stories, right? So they offer a more, I don't want to say this, it's more detailed, okay? We'll get into television and things and radio in a little bit in a minute, but those are condensed. Print media is much more detailed and it's much more comprehensive. Now that's changing quickly as some of these other sources of media are becoming better and more credible. But even today, print media is still the main source of news statistically for the educated elites of this country. And like it or not, they are the ones who are typically have most of the say in policy making, right? So it's still very, very important. That's print media, newspapers, magazines, that sort of thing. The next type is broadcast media. We talk about broadcast media, excuse me. That was planned. Broadcast media is television and radio, all right? And I know that we always talk about this day and age, social media and the internet, which we're going to get to, and how that's taken over everything. But statistically speaking, broadcast media, basically network and cable television news on TV, obviously television news is on TV, it remains an extremely important source of political information, all right? Radio reaches a little bit less diverse audience, conservative, that's right-wing, Republican. Talk radio still has a major impact, a major presence in our political media landscape. But as far as reaching a more diverse populace, we're going to say television is a little bit more important than radio. The major drawback is that these stories on television have to be short. When you're watching the news, these stories are 2 minutes or less, right? So they have to condense it, and they're far less informative. They're really, really just scanning the surface on a lot of stuff. Third form of media, that's the internet. Obviously, as you all know, the internet is well, depending on your connection, right? But the internet is right now, and one huge part about that is that our news stories can get updated very, very quickly. It's almost like something happens, and we can know about it almost instantly. So that's great. Sometimes it forces these different news outlets to come up with stories fast and to try to grab our attention with, what are called hot takes or clickbait, where it seems as though some media outlets are just trying to be more bold and outlandish, I should say, to try to get our attention. Like I said, hot takes, clickbait, that type of thing, and those are a little bit less trustworthy. So, internet media has evolved. When it comes to politics, it started off, there were maybe blogs about politics, and then after that, that kind of evolved because we have a very polarized country, right? We're divided between the political right and the political left. So it started turning into right-wing and left-wing news sites, which permeates the internet today, right? Social media is also part of the internet, and you all know what social media is, right? All those different apps, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, so on and so forth, right? And what that has allowed politicians, campaigns, political parties, a new way to get their information out to the masses, like I said, instantly. So if this is your only source of information, you are rarely, if ever, getting the full story, right? Because this is coming straight from those sources. However, the internet also opens up access to much more non-commercially supported sources of information. And that's very, very important because the media is a business, whether it's television, depending on your site, on the internet and radio. In order to make money, they rely on advertisers, right? So these different companies are giving them money, and in exchange, they're doing commercials on television or on the radio, or the sites that are on the side of your internet screen, what have you. And when the media is being funded by a commercial source, right? It's oftentimes those media outlets are going to shy away from criticizing either their parent companies or their advertisers in the news. So the fact that it's for money and it's for a business has a major impact on what is covered and how it is covered, right? But online, you can find sources that are dedicated to being non-commercially funded, which in theory, much more unbiased, objective, clean, down the center, right? Trust in the media is a huge topic today. So that means trusting the news, right? And this comes in the form of bias. The media is a business, and the media is inherently biased. Now, they are rarely going to just outright lie. Now, we do hear about that, right? More and more today with misinformation, fake news, that sort of things. But when an outlet is kind of busted on fake news or misinformation, they lose the public's trust. So they don't rarely want to come out and just bold-faced lie. Although we do have to be aware of that sort of thing for sure, especially on your social media, right? Fact-checking and things like that, which we'll get into later on, because that's very, very important. But it's the way that the information is given to you, right? So because they don't want to lose the public trust, and readers and viewers will go somewhere else if they find out that this site is putting out garbage, right? So what are the factors that are influencing the news? All right, one, looking at my notes here, the journalists themselves who make it, because they have the discretion of to both report the news, right, and to interpret the news. And they have varying degrees of bias towards political ideologies, right? And it should be noted that statistically, more journalists identify as being liberal or Democrat than conservative and Republican. So when you hear these criticisms coming from the right, that's not completely unfounded, and we'll get to that at the end here when I give you guys this political bias chart. But different news outlets are biased on both sides, the left and right, the Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal side of the political spectrum, right? So the journalists themselves they have bias. The politicians and the source of political news, all right? It's not just about, shaking hands and kissing babies at Walmart when they're running for a political campaign, right? They show up specifically at specific events, and they cultivate relationships with the press, with the reporters, and they do that by leaking information, right? They call that leaks. And if they, you get these anonymous sources to a reporter talking about what's going on in the White House or anywhere, they are, if they're the ones giving the information to the media, then they can oftentimes kind of take control of the narrative and shape the way that the information is going to go from them to the media and from the media to us, the consumers and the public, right? They also do it with press releases. The White House does that almost daily right now, where the politicians will, write speeches or come out in news conferences and specifically give out information to the media to then have the media give it out to everybody else. And then finally, we the consumers have a huge influence on the media, right? Because the media needs an audience, and therefore they report on the news in a way that they believe people will want to consume it, and report in a way that is tailored for those that they are targeting. Now, where this is sometimes controversial is because who are they targeting? Usually wealthier people and higher educated people, because among other reasons they're statistically more likely to watch the news. That does not mean people that aren't wealthy aren't informed, and the people that aren't educated don't pay attention to the news. But statistically speaking, the wealthier and higher educated are targeted because they're the ones watching it more. Oftentimes this means that some groups of people and that their concerns are underreported in terms of the media attention proportionate to their size. As we're talking the working class, we're talking union groups, we're talking religious groups, we're talking military veterans, and various minorities, whether that's ethnic, racial, whatever. The coverage that they're getting sometimes is disproportionate with regards to how much of a percentage of our population they have compared to what the media is reporting on. And that usually shifts around election times, oddly enough. The media is extremely influential in that information is key to understanding how and why our politicians act. And in many ways, the most important thing about the media is what it doesn't cover, right? Because it's hard for voters and other citizens to put pressure on our elected officials to do something about a certain issue if they don't even know that it is an issue, right? Which, when you're reading these handouts that I'm giving you on teams about the public sphere and things like that, the gatekeeper, that's huge. There are news sites that are dedicated. One I really like is Vice News, but there are others. Al Jazeera does a good job of really, really trying to report on things that nobody else is reporting on. And that's important because, right now everything is coronavirus, right? And with good reason. That's super important. I'm not saying that it shouldn't. But, all the time we look at our news cycle, it's like something gets reported on intensively for a couple weeks, and then it disappears. And later on you're like, oh, is that still a thing? Or is that going on? Or maybe you come across a news story and you're like, nobody knows that this is going on, right? So what is being reported on is what impacts our politicians. And so in that way, in their role as gatekeeper, the media is extremely important in our political system, right? Final thing I want to talk about is on Teams, I've given you a link to a media bias chart for 2020. So it's a grid like in math, right? With all these different sources of media, which I want to pull up for myself, right? So the way this chart works is there's, both a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. That horizontal axis is just like the political spectrum that we've already talked about. On the right is conservative, more Republican. On the left, liberal, Democrat, right? And everything in between. So as you're looking for wherever you find your news, as it's popping up on your social media or whatever, where it is in regards to right, left, or center. So the stuff that's in the middle is the least biased in terms of leaning towards a political party or a political ideology. So ideally, you want to go towards things that are in the middle or closer to the middle than the stuff that is extreme out on the edges. Just as important, arguably more important, that vertical axis, the stuff on the top, those are the most trustworthy and reliable sources for news. Those are things that put a very, very high priority on original fact reporting, right? Complex analysis of mix of fact reporting and analysis. The stuff that's lower to the bottom, that is trash. And I'd like you to point out there is trash on both the conservative and liberal side of things, right? Things like InfoWars on the far right is garbage. Things like the Palmer Report, right? On the left, garbage. You don't, regardless of what political affiliation you lean towards, that stuff that is irreliable. You want to stay away from that. You want to go towards the top, the apex of that chart. In the middle, things like, NPR, slightly to the left, but highly credible. The Associated Press, or AP, excellent. Right down the middle, or as close as possible. Reuters, slightly to the right, or as close to the middle as you can be, but a high level of fact checking and analysis. So it's really, really cool and important that you take a look at that chart just to kind of have an idea of where you want to go when you have a choice to find information. And it's good to keep in mind when information comes to you, you can say, okay, where is this coming from and where do they fall on this chart? That's about everything that I got. So you have a Teams assignment, all right, where I have a couple different PowerPoints and a couple different readings on the public sphere and the role of the media in our society. Some of the stuff that I've already talked about will come up again. And then there's a Word document attached to that with some questions. Only four questions where I want you to answer and then submit just that blank Word document that's entitled Student Work Template Media Teams Assignment or something like that. Stay active, you guys. Physically active. It's very, very important this time. Don't be staying up all night and doing nothing but playing video games or staring at your phone, swiping on your social media. If you can, go for walks or jogs, exercise, body weight exercises in your house. Read. If you're religious or spiritual, pray. During this time where the cage door is closed, it's important that you are cultivating physical health, mental health, social and emotional health to the best of your ability, and spiritual health. And so, eventually the cage doors are going to open up, and the people coming out are going to either be ready to eat or be eaten. So be working on your best self during this time. Appreciate you guys. Miss you guys terribly, and we'll be good. We'll all get to this together. God bless America, Mr. Wiener.